Millions of despairing men, women, and little children, victims of a system that makes men torture and imprison innocent people.
You cannot shake hands with a clenched fist.
Produced by a nuclear exchange would be carried by wind and water and soil and seed to the far corners of
the kingdom of God, the kingdom of heaven.
It's one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind.
We're not saying that planet Earth is coming to an end. We're saying that planet Earth is about to be refurbished, spaded under, and have another chance to serve as a garden for another civilization.
Most of the people in here are just your reflections. They're your mistakes.
1776 will commence again if you try to take our firearms.
1 million of the planet's 8 million species are threatened.
You are what you repeatedly do. Therefore, excellence ought to be a habit, not an act.
Your lives and the credibility of the United Nations is at stake.
Epstein didn't kill himself.
The reason this is such an interesting time is not only because we're on the threshold of the end of this civilization.
They're trying to take you out with bullshit.
The experience of the past 2 years has proven beyond doubt that no nation can appease the Nazis.
To those who can hear me, I say, do not despair. The misery that is now upon us is but the passing of greed, the bitterness of men who fear the way of human progress. The hate of men will pass, and dictators die, and the power they took from the people will return to the people. And so long as men die, liberty will never perish.
In the language of the U.S. Department of Defense, these are unidentified aerial phenomena.
Roswell's a very interesting place with a lot of people that would like to know what's going on.
There is very compelling evidence that we may not be alone.
This is the Garden of Doom.
Welcome everyone into Garden of Doom, and this week we are having a new guest, but through a mutual friend, and this is John Barnwell. So John, first of all, thank you very much for joining us, and how are you doing this evening?
Oh, I'm doing great. It's my pleasure to come and visit you.
No, it's our pleasure. And so first I want to thank our mutual friend, that's Reverend Dr. David Parry, who some of you probably have heard his voice and his name on this show. His name certainly because he's the force behind the Nephilim Anthropology Conference. So for those of you who would like to see that event live, you can go to Glasgow. But for those of you who can't get to Glasgow in October 28th and 29th, there are virtual tickets available. And the more of you buy those, the more likely it is that they fly me into Glasgow. And I would like to go to Glasgow. So I'm going to get it out early now. It's Nacon, NACON.eventbrite, which is one word, EVENTBRITE.co, not com, co.uk. And ticket prices are very reasonable for 2 days, and it's a multidisciplinary panel. And that was a long way of saying that John is a mutual friend through the good Reverend Doctor. They actually did a podcast together. They did over 100 episodes together. And actually, I'm going to let John tell you a little bit about himself, because I don't think anyone's going to, because he actually owns a very impressive bookstore, unique in the world. So, John, tell him a little bit about your background and all your 411.
Well, just to preface this with a little correction, I don't own a bookstore. I manage the largest alternative, metaphysical, holistic bookstore in the world for many years.
Okay, wonderful.
And, but yeah, it's almost like owning it. And through my association with the bookstore, I was able to come into contact with many international figures and authors and spiritual teachers and yogis and archaeologists, historians, philosophers. The list is virtually just endless because it was day in and day out. And at that time, there was no internet. So if you wanted to get into a subject, you had no other recourse but then to visit a place such as the Mayflower. And like I said, we were the most extensive in the world. At least that's according to Donald Weiser, who ran Weiser's bookstore in New York. And they always told him he had the largest, and he came by with his wife, and he said, well, I just want to tell you that they tell me that I have the biggest, and you're twice the size of mine. And that was before we moved from our place on Woodward into Berkeley and doubled the size of our inventory. So it was really quite a learning experience being able to associate with so many fascinating people. Of course, my principal area of study is the work of Dr. Rudolf Steiner, whose collected edition is in excess of some 350 volumes, so that's a lifelong study.
Yes, indeed. And John has written 2 books himself, and we're certainly going to talk about those. And I don't think we can talk about those without going into a little bit of background. So we're going to talk a little bit about things like arcane wisdom, the noble traveler, and concepts such as those. We've had shows on Tarot here, so if folks haven't listened to those, you may want to go back and take a listen, because that may be helpful to know about the major arcana or arcana. There's 22 of them, and there's also there's a 22-fold stanza in the Light on the Path. So these are things that, listen, I don't expect too many people who are listening to understand what all of this means right now, but that's why we have John here. So maybe it's best to start with, who's Rudolf Steiner and what were his teachings? Yep, lost your sound. You're muted.
Okay.
There.
Well, first off, you said it right there that someone would not be familiar with all there is to a subject. You made reference to that, and of course, that's the whole point of a bookstore, is to be able to expand one's learning, and the extent of that would depend upon, of course, the reader's ability to be able to try and take steps through any particular field of study that they might be involved in. And so a lot of what I did at the time was they would come back and they'd say, okay, now what? And I would point them in the direction of one or numerous sources that would help them fulfill whatever curriculum they were pursuing, their field of study, whether spiritual or historic or philosophical or psychological or astrological. It really didn't matter, and it was working at high speed, to say the least. But ultimately, that led me into an association with the work of Rudolf Steiner, which, again, was really the first page in my spiritual biography was turned when I heard the name Rudolf Steiner. I was in gym class with my friend next to me. He was the grandson of the Polish ambassador. He turned to me, because we lined up alphabetically. He turned to me in gym class, because he was right next to me. He says, have you ever heard of Rudolf Steiner? And it rang a bell in my heart. I didn't know what it meant, but I had a definite feeling that resulted from that. He also told me about Ouspensky, and I found him interesting but too intellectual. But Rudolf Steiner ultimately became a lifelong pursuit for me. So we're talking about, this was in the 8th grade. Okay, they call it middle school now. Junior high, we called it back then. But that was like, back in the early middle 60s. And so I've been able to pursue Rudolf Steiner's work. And ultimately, the Mayflower sold more of Rudolf Steiner's books than anybody in the English-speaking world. And so it brought me into relationship with a lot of the various authors that worked in that field and all of that. But ultimately, what led me to writing my books was I was in association with Ralph Marinelli, who was he was one of the heads of the Waldorf Institute that was the teacher training program for Waldorf schools. And Waldorf schools were founded by Rudolf Steiner. It's the largest private education system in the world. And he was one of the 3 principals. And we began an area of study regarding a comment that Rudolf Steiner said that science needs to come to understand that the heart is not a pump. And unless they got past that mechanistic view of the heart, certain things couldn't take place. And so we found that to be a challenge. And working as the laboratory assistant with Ralph Marinelli, we were able to unequivocally prove the heart was not a pump. As far as exactly what is the heart, that developed and is still developing. One of the associates to the paper that was written, Dr. Franco First, has written numerous articles and books relative to the subject, and I leave that to specialists in the field. But at the end of my association with Ralph as his editor and lab assistant, I decided that I was going to pursue it more from the historic literary pursuit. And so that brought me to writing my first book, and that's The Arcana of the Grail Angel, the spiritual science of the Holy Blood and of the Holy Grail. It's a study developed under the work of Rudolf Steiner of the underground streams of esoteric Christianity, which flowed from the Brotherhood of the Holy Grail to the Order of the Knights Templar and to the true Rosicrucian order, and has a foreword by my best buddy, Dr. Douglas Gabriel. And in there, I use the 22 major arcana as a study tool to be able to work out the cosmology as presented in the work of Rudolf Steiner. And I also used that cosmological sequence because I found it to be within the book, A Light on the Path. It was written down by Mabel Collins. And this has a foreword by William Bento, the noted astrosopher and astrologer. And in there, that's more of a meditative tool, the second book. The first book is more of a 30,000-foot view of history, so to speak, going all the way from the Stone Age, and actually even before that, but primarily from the Stone Age up to the present time and projecting on into the future.
Very small topic then. So if it's even humanly possible, what is the crux of Steiner's message?
Well, the crux of Steiner's work is essentially, it's called Anthroposophia. And what does that mean? Well, Anthroposophia is like anthropos is man and Sophia is wisdom. So it's the wisdom of being human.
Right.
And so it's difficult to develop a wholesome relationship to what a human being should be about if you don't really know what a human being is. And Rudolf Steiner, who was a noted scientific writer and also a literary writer who did a lot of articles for reviews and all of that, but he ended up becoming the editor of Johann Wolfgang von Goethe's scientific papers for the Goethe Archive. And it was put together for the Kirchner collected edition of Goethe's work. And coming out of that field of study, he realized the relevance of Goethe's development of the science of morphology and how history has a metamorphosis, and that different historical periods, they're not the same, and that human beings throughout history, they're not the same, that there's this unfolding cadence of human evolution that's involved. And through his abilities of supersensible perception, was able to observe these types of developments through what's called the Akashic record, which maintains a record of all activities that have happened during the course of history and before.
I've heard the Akashic record referred to almost like a spiritual cloud, like the cloud stores data, not an actual, cirrus or, cumulus cloud. But is that even close to a good parallel?
Well, I think that's could be an effective artistic way of living with the idea, because until one comes into a relationship with certain things like the realms beyond the physical, the etheric and the astral, and then the realm in which the I am or ego dwells, are vastly different than the world that we know. And it's a good idea in pursuing these that we don't paint ourselves into a corner conceptually. And that's what people tend to do. They want to try and make the world fit their model of reality. I prefer to maintain an open-ended pursuit and just try to improve my questions, because many times the situation, just when you think you got it figured out, all of a sudden you'll get new data, and then a whole nother panoramic view can unfold. So it behooves one to be humble.
In my 3 or 4 years of doing this show and coming across people who have, talk more about the spiritual and the theosophical and the Anthroposophia, which I'm sure I just botched how to pronounce it, but we know the word. I've heard different ways of getting to the Akashic record. One, is everyone's sort of favorite is psychedelics, ayahuasca. Another is just deep meditation. Your vision quest, so to speak. Another is through luminaries. You've been chosen by someone, whether it's an angel, a luminary, some other high spirit that sort of tasked you or is connecting you. And then another method is through just learning. And of course, learning includes contemplation, so that can be a sort of meditation in and of itself. So those two may or may not, in the Venn diagram, they may or not overlap. They probably do. But do you believe that the path is through learning, or are the other ones available as well?
Well, I think that all these various facets are there, but I think it behooves one to gather some knowledge, and that's the point of why Rudolf Steiner also referred this Geisteswissenschaft, and this spiritual science is what it is, and so that he said that it was the destiny of mankind to be able to develop the thinking principle and to be able to take that with oneself and that sense for truth when one crosses the threshold into the next world. Given the understanding that most of the conclusions that you've developed during your life will be left at the door because they will no longer be applicable in the way that you think. And that really, 3 of the recommended ways that Rudolf Steiner recommended for spiritual development was art, music, and history. And it might sound a little strange thinking of them in having some kind of connection, but they actually give you something that you can work with over time and gradually unfold one's sense for truth. And like through art, it doesn't limit you. If you just approach things analytically and trying to work through it with your abstract mind, you're going to end up leaving a great deal out of the picture.
Yeah, I don't find it unusual at all to think of this. I've actually heard art described as frozen music.
Yeah, that's a good description. And architecture is frozen music because the original designation of that, I forget which author it was.
Well, an architect told me the quote, so that makes perfect sense.
Yeah. And that's actually true. And you can look at the great cathedrals that were constructed under the directorship of the Knights Templar, and you can see, like, they call them choirs, and this whole idea of that they were places in which, unless there was people in there, it wasn't really manifesting what it was supposed to manifest. Whereas, in distinction from that, in the ancient world, you had temples where the human being wasn't even necessary for it to be what it was.
Right.
So it's a very distinction having that whole idea of the community had now become a part of that whole spiritualizing process.
Okay, now I can't, have the term Grail Angel out there without, firstly, we probably have to go back to the Grail. So in this view of the Grail, is it an actual physical cup or something more Da Vinci Code-ish or something else entirely?
Well, and that's brings up the point I'm trying to make. When you approach things artistically, you leave the individual free and to pursue it, because it's a quest. It's a quest of the Holy Grail, right? Mm-hmm. So you're searching, and it's an open-ended quest. I mean, in the Grail story of Wolfgang von Eschenbach, there's Lady Adventure, and he's telling you to open your heart, right? Well, what does that mean? I mean, are you supposed to rip yourself open, or is this is more of a gesture of entering into that realm of warmth, the source of love in our being? And so you don't want to over describe and be over final. So many historians, they try to receive their understandings and take it to closure as if it's like this great accomplishment. But I see them as just like signposts, it's like it's pointing in a particular direction. Because if you look at the word Grail, it's translated from the word gradani in Latin, which means gradually. So we know it's something that comes along gradually. Now, the Grail is described by Wolfgang von Eschenbach variously as a thing or a stone. And then you can get into the Grail lore and say it tells about how in the early Christian centuries, the angels took the Grail and they lifted up into the spiritual world until an individual would come along that was worthy to receive the Grail kingship, which was Parsifal, the pure fool. Right? He's the pure fool. He was raised, his mother, Hertzleute, which means heart's sorrow. Her husband had ran off to be a knight, and he never came back. And so she was bound and determined that Parsifal, who was born and never really knew his father because he'd gone off on a crusade. And so she was going to make sure that her son didn't do that. So they lived out in the wilds and grew up in the forest amongst the animals and the trees. And he didn't really know anything. He was like totally naive. And then one day, these knights show up, and he didn't know what they were. And these guys with these suits of armor on and all this regalia, and he starts questioning them, and it becomes eminently clear that here's a guy that's a bumpkin who doesn't really know anything. And that's kind of an image of a modern individual before they've pursued the path. We're bumpkins. We don't really know anything. And we're starting from scratch, so to speak. And that's okay. That's what somebody has to understand, that anybody can qualify themselves to begin the Grail quest. It is not an exclusive club because Christ came for all beings. And so it doesn't limit it to just members of a particular elite club. Although there are elite clubs that partake of this, it's not exclusively a property of them.
Was Parsifal Percival?
Well, sometimes it has various spellings. Percival is more the British spelling,
Same person, though.
Yeah.
So you identify Grail Angels singular, but you said the Grail Angels or the angels. Actually, it reminds me of the Myths of Avalon, how the nuns they took, or someone took Arthur. The Arthur story is very reminiscent. And, I've had someone say that the Arthur story was just the story of Jesus, just written as a British chivalry story, so that they wouldn't get in trouble, for writing the Christ story. I don't know if there's any truth to that or not, but it certainly is appealing. Anyway, my initial question was, who's the Grail Angel?
Okay, when you get down to that develops a whole cascade of concepts to be able to even come close to it. First of all, a very good friend of mine, Joe Visconti, who ran for governor out in Connecticut, among other things, and he's the president of the American Shakespeare Theater, and he's an Emmy Award-winning videographer. All this, he's done all this stuff, right? But he, like myself, has spent his life studying the work of Rudolf Steiner. And when he approaches a subject, he tries to bring it into a practical sphere of activity, because he's a builder. That's his principal trade, and so he has to deal with very, very practical people. So the way in which he would explain something is quite different from the way I might explain it, for example. But in getting into understanding what a Grail Angel entails, if you go to the work of Rudolf Steiner, you'll see that it's rooted in a very old tradition. And you can look in scripture and you can find an event that's told about St. Paul when he goes to Athens, and he ends up meeting Dionysius the Areopagite. And he meets him, and there's a woman also with him, and he ends up becoming the first bishop of Athens. And you can go to the preserved writings of the tradition of Dionysius the Areopagite that eventually came to be written in the 6th century by one of his successors, in which is told how he came to be a Christian, and because he was like one of the judges basically for Athens. But out of that tradition is a book that's usually called the Celestial Hierarchies. And in there are the classical names for the hierarchical beings, or the angelic beings, the angel, the archangel, the archai, the exousiai, adunamis, kuriotetes, thrones, cherubim, seraphim. So there's that series of 9 supersensible beings that are treated as a reality. And the funny thing is why I mentioned Joe is because a while back, he went around and he started asking anybody he'd run into, do you believe in angels? And he said, they almost always said yes. And so people believe in angels, but they don't quite know what to do with it. They believe in it. What are you supposed to do? Again, they're like Parsifal. They don't really know what can I do to gain insights into this? And I would say that the best place I know to look is the work of Rudolf Steiner, because his work is embedded within the understandings based upon the understanding of the 9-fold spiritual hierarchies. And so your Grail Angel, when you go to his principal work, Esoteric Science and Outline, also previously called Occult Science and Outline, in there he said, were I to give this work another title, it would be the Grail. And so you see that the Grail is this thing that you gradually come to understand that involves the angelic hierarchies, and that this is an actual spiritual stream that leads all the way back to St. Paul, who founded that first esoteric school, and that these teachings are the fruit of that particular spiritual stream. Although it's hardly ever mentioned by your typical theologians, they do mention Dionysius the Areopagite. You can't ignore him. I mean, he's the second most quoted source in the works of St. Thomas Aquinas in the Summa Theologia, next to the Bible. And so you have him playing a prominent role in the history of Christianity, but it's a role in which your average Christian parishioner, shall we say, is unaware of.
Right. Yeah, this is sort of church history, or really beyond church history. It's not so much studying the scripture itself, which is what a lot of people do. So we're not going to say it's Michael or Raphael or Metatron or something like that. It's a bigger cadre than that. Well,
there is that too. See, so when most people, Rudolf Steiner once said that most people, when they have an experience of God or of Christ, usually what happens is they have an experience of their guardian angel, and they interpret that to mean that they had met God, you know. Mm-hmm. And but the angel, angelos, means messenger. Mm-hmm. And so were God to communicate to you, he would communicate to you through an angel. See?
So Malachi, right?
Well, Malak, that means Lord, but and then there's Moloch, which
Moloch is different entirely.
And that's that spirit of pestilence and money and greed. And
sort of like the Babylonian baby eater, a demon.
Yeah, that's the thing that we're struggling against, actually. You know, and that was the opponent of the Templars, so to speak, was that.
Well, that's great.
That spirit of darkness.
I mean, I'm saying that's great. Like, that's great, but bad choice of words, but I was just, my next question was going to be about the Templars, but unless you haven't finished on the angel part, because that was really interesting.
Well, you're in charge, you know, so we can go any which way you like.
Okay, well, let's go to what the Templars' real role in this was, because you can talk to a million different people about the Templars, and you'll probably get a million different interpretations and versions, and I've spoken to wonderful people who've traced the Templars, into North America, which may or may not be true. I mean, back in hundreds of years ago. I don't mean through an order now. But what were the Templars' role in this, and how does that turn into the Rosicrucians? I confess, I read that book, The Chemical Wedding. Everyone says it's filled with symbolism. All of it was lost on me. I probably have to read it about 17 more times to get it, but I probably won't. But for the Cliff Note versions of like, what's the real role of the Templars? What's the line to the Rosicrucians? Then maybe we can circle back to that Grail Angel, that pesky Grail Angel.
Let's go back and we look at the founding of the Knights Templar, and by a small circle of knights coming from France, right. And so you have this relationship that's described as to protect pilgrims to the Holy Land and things of that nature. But really, when you look at it more deeply, if you get into some of the indications of Rudolf Steiner, it was a striving to create a Christian center that was separate from Rome, and that the papal Rome had become such a dominant force of a particular type of Christianity that there were those nobles that wanted to be able to not sever their relationship to Rome so much as be able to facilitate a center to where they could pursue it, and there were certain subjects of more depth that were involved. Mind you, at that time, you weren't even supposed to possess a Bible, right? That was the rule. If you wanted to find out about the Bible, you went to the church, and the priest told you what you were supposed to believe and think out of the Bible. And so there's this whole idea that there's this underground stream of Christianity, which is tied into this stream I referred to earlier regarding Dionysius the Areopagite and the events in the first century leading up to published writings in the 6th century that ended up with the closing of the Platonic Academy, shifting over into the East and Syria and parts, and then the information traveling up into Constantinople, and Michael the Stammerer presenting copies to the Carolingian court. Back in the 8th and 9th century, there's this whole ferment of this Grail stream. So it's very much tied into actual historical events. And Rudolf Steiner is very clear to make that point. Although he's, it's distributed over many places throughout his work. You really have to do diligent study to be able to piece it all together, which is part of the reason that I wrote my book. I was able to bring various threads together to give people more to work with, to approach such a daunting subject, and to have the whole cosmological backdrop, because in my works, you'll find that there's a whole series of diagrams that lay out this esoteric cosmology and how it all relates to the ancient mysteries and the modern mysteries and the destiny of mankind. And I had done extensive research because here's a 4-volume bibliography that I wrote years ago on ancient Egypt and Mesopotamian studies from the library of Dr. Marjorie Fisher. And I compiled the back. It was finished in 1998, years to do. But so I've done very much extensive studies to be able to come to the conclusions that I came to.
Okay. And who are the Rosicrucians?
Okay, the Rosicrucians it's very interesting because the Rosicrucians, you could see them as a continuation of this Grail stream after the demise of the Knights Templar, that esoteric core of the Templar stream was taken up by the Rosicrucians. And so you have the story of Christian Rosicrucians traveling to the east and receiving certain mystery teachings and cosmological teachings, and then coming back and finding that basically in the courts in which he went, that they weren't really interested in what he had to say so much. So he gathered around him a small group of people to be his students, and that's the legendary account. But it's something that extends even further back in time, and it's hard to abbreviate it properly, but basically what I could say is that there is an esoteric Christianity that runs parallel to your ordinary exoteric or mundane Christianity that most people encounter, but that you'll find that there's a great many more people that are aware of that than one might think, and even people that you wouldn't think are influenced by it in a profound way. One of my teachers was in Italy, and he went to the city of Assisi, where the great center of the Franciscan monks of St. Francis of Assisi. And he went there, and he was looking at a painting, and one of the friars walks up to him and says, "Excuse me, are you an anthroposophist?" He says, "Why, yes, how'd you know?" He said, "Well, by the way you were looking at that painting, come with me." And so he took him down into the basement of the monastery, and there was this great library, and included in the library they had the complete collected edition at that time of the works of Rudolf Steiner, and they were diligently studying it. It was in the original German, and he, of course, spoke German and English and everything. And they were asking him all these questions. And that's Werner Glass, who was he was a protege of Walter Johannes Stein, who wrote 9th century world history in the light of the Holy Grail, and was one of the central figures around Rudolf Steiner. But Werner Glass was his protege, and Werner Glass was my teacher, and my best friend Douglas was Werner Glass's protege. So that there's very much a connection to this. And in fact, when Werner came to Detroit to found the Waldorf Institute, he told me this story. I took him out to dinner one time. He told me this story about he went to this Duns Scotus, which is a monastery outside of Detroit, and he went there to check it out for a possible location for moving the teacher training. And so he went there, and it looked just like the monastery at Assisi. And they took him in, and they took him down into this library, and it looked just like the library in Assisi. That, he said, that's when I knew this is where the Institute was supposed to be, because there was that connection, that there are actually Franciscan monks that are studying Rudolf Steiner, you know. And so he thought this will be a friendly environment.
This was not on my agenda, but you can't really talk about the Masons, the Templars and the Rosicrucians without talking about the Masons. And I'm not sure if there's any accuracy to that or not. I can't tell you how many people I've encountered who say that I'm a Mason, and if I could tell you all the knowledge I have, I would. And, you know, this is on social media. And it just seems to me that if you're a Mason, you would never put that on social media. I mean, it's just so, you know, it's like saying I'm a Knight of the Round Table, you know. I don't know. But, do the Masons
they become a little more, outward in the last, shall we say, 40 years or so, trying to rehabilitate their image, because there are Masonic lodges that have taken a dark turn, you know, and there is some real problems in Freemasonry as we speak. For example, the lodges in the West Coast, or the lodges in Denver. You know, the infiltration of the lodges by people who follow the work of Aleister Crowley, which is not wholesome, you know, but yet Freemasonry itself comes out of a wholesome Christian impulse. And so you have the builders of the cathedrals, and it leads back actually to the Roman College of Builders. You know, there's a whole tradition of the builders, and that it's that Cain stream.
Right.
And then you have the able stream of King Solomon, and that Solomon was able to conceive of the temple, but he didn't have the skills to build it. So he brings in Hiram, king of Tyre, and Hiram of Biff, who's his builder. And it was Hiram of Biff, who's of that Cain stream, that has the ability to be able to work as an artisan and build the temple of Solomon. So there's that whole idea of, it was an opportunity for those two streams to reconcile, but then there's the whole story of how the Queen of Sheba gets involved, and the workmen, the jealous workmen end up killing Hiram of Biff, and that supposedly King Solomon knew about it, and he could have stopped it, but he didn't because of his jealousy over the Queen of Sheba. And so there's a whole interesting lore that has to do with this struggle between the stream of Abel and the stream of Cain, and that's a central task of mankind, and that it was reconciled ultimately through the incarnation of Jesus Christ.
Yeah, well, that's an old grudge if it goes back to person 3 and 4, unless you believe that they also had twin sisters at the time, as well, that, you know, names comes later. But as I understand the Masonic legend involving Cain, and I've seen some other places where it's duplicated, basically when Cain was exiled, he had children and grandchildren. He built a city. I think he called it Enoch, not the same Enoch that was the ascended Enoch. But the city didn't last for whatever. So all of his kids and grandkids, they all had these skills, sort of like from the song Donovan Atlantis, you know, the poet, the artist, the builder, the magician, the healer, like all of these, the warrior, all of these sort of skills came from Cain, the sort of like what you would consider, I guess, industrialization, whereas farming and husbandry and things like that were with the Adam line, and so I guess they had to. Solomon had to bring them back together to build the temple. He needed the great builders. Though I confess I have no idea why the city of Enoch didn't last if the great builders were there. But maybe like the great builders of the pyramid, they had to fail a few times before they could build the one that lasted.
Well, you know, there is that whole lore, and if you approach it artistically, then you don't have to worry as much about dotting all your I's and crossing all your T's, and assume that you're approaching a subject and it's mythic in content. It doesn't mean it isn't talking about something, but it's the way in which it's talking about it that gives its kind of magical potency, so to speak. But that you have this idea of these are mythic themes that are relevant for mankind to be able to riddle out the destiny of a human being and the unfolding of the human being in a wholesome way. And so whether or not things are strictly true historically in the way they are presented, we have to leave it to the rare individuals like Rudolf Steiner to be able to look into the Akashic record and give us an indication of that which might be specifically relevant historically. And that's the challenge, because Rudolf Steiner had said that one of the things that Christ accomplished through his incarnation, being the one and only incarnation of a divine spiritual being of that stature in a human body, that he would never reincarnate, that he came that one time, and were he to come again, it'd be as if he didn't get it right the first time. And that Christ came in that incarnation, and he entered into earth evolution. And as Christ said, I shall be with you to the end of the earth. So that he is here, but it's now up to us to be able to take up the task of coming to a relationship to Christ, rather than waiting for something to come to us the way it would in the ancient world, as just a gift of the spiritual world. You know, that ancient mankind had clairvoyance, but it was a gift of the spiritual world. Now, if mankind is to come to clairvoyant understanding in the right way, it would be through their own attainment.
I note that you mentioned Aleister Crowley, and, you know, I don't know a lot about the man or his work. I hear mixed things, I guess, depending on who the consumer is. You know, you described it as not wholesome. And in the foreword written it was named H.P. Blavatsky, who, of course, I mean, you know, her and Aleister Crowley, I mean, you know, you almost can't have a conversation about one without mentioning the other. So I'm assuming from her mention in the foreword that you have a more favorable view of her, but that's not, whether I'm right or wrong about that isn't really the important part. The question is, who in your view, or what in your view was Aleister Crowley saying? Where did he go wrong, and where does H.P. Blavatsky fit into this?
Well, that becomes that would take up a whole episode just to scratch the surface. But basically, you know, Aleister Crowley himself declared himself the great beast, right? I mean, he was very much into this dramatic, role-playing, theatrical, ritual way of doing things. And it's interesting to note that he did visit where Rudolf Steiner was, but Rudolf Steiner refused to see him. And as Rudolf Steiner had also refused to see George Gurdjieff. So, because he considered that their manner of approaching the esoteric wasn't wholesome, and which is, you know, those are the only two people that I can think of ever hearing that he refused to see, because Rudolf Steiner had a continual stream of people coming and visiting him. You know, people like Albert Schweitzer and all manner of historic figures would come to his lectures and come to speak with him personally. And so, but, you know, I know a lot about Crowley's work, more than most of the people that think they know something. And likewise with Blavatsky. And with Blavatsky, what I can say is her focus became more the Eastern school and that of esoteric Buddhism, and understanding things based upon the principles of Advaita Vedanta, Hinduism, and esoteric Buddhism. Although her Isis Unveiled was coming from a more Rosicrucian type inspiration, for various reasons, she ended up gravitating and eventually moving to Adyar in India and basing her center of influence out of Adyar in India, which is all well and good, and it influenced very significant people, played a big role in the ultimately the achievement of independence of India, and influenced people like Mahatma Gandhi, and it all goes on and on. Henry Steele Olcott, who was the co-founder with Blavatsky of the Theosophical Society, if you mention his name in southern India, I mean, he's like one of the most respected people there. He helped reform Buddhism in southern India and Sri Lanka. So, these are formidable figures. But with Blavatsky, she's kind of chaotic in her writing style, but she knows way more than a great many people that supposedly know a lot. But it's difficult to get it through her writings because she's kind of a chaotic writer, and she's all over the map, So it's a lifetime study in and of itself, just studying her secret doctrine.
Yeah, I'm well aware I'm going to probably have to do separate shows on Aleister Crowley and Blavatsky as well, maybe with you. I don't know. Whoever's willing to do it, who I can find that knows it well enough. All right, well, let's move on to your books, because, you told us what one of the words means, and I saw there were a bunch of words in here and a couple, but I've a question. I think it's obvious, but the name Adam Kadmon was thrown around. I assume that's Adam, first Admin, and Kadmon means first man in some language.
It's the archetypal human.
Okay. So
it's like the Adam Kadmon of the Kabbalah.
Well, there's another thing I don't know much about is, even though I've had a show on Kabbalah and Kabbalah Sun, obviously I haven't studied it. Okay. So there was also Theosophia, which I guess is the wisdom of God.
Yes, correct.
And there was Philosophia, which is the love of wisdom, I believe.
Yes.
Right. So those were the other two concepts with Anthroposophia, and that's. But by the way, on a side note, that's what Reverend Parry was trying to change the name to the NACOD and the Phelim, Anthroposophia or Anthroposophia Conference.
Anthroposophy.
And nobody can say it, and everyone knows what anthropology is, and nobody knows what that is. There are not enough people, and he wisely kept it at anthropology, or, I would just be saying NACON forever instead of saying the Phelim Anthropology.
Yes. Well, it's interesting. It's a word that's before Rudolf Steiner was not encountered very much. I mean, you have the alchemical writings of Thomas Vaughan, for example, the brother of Henry Vaughan, the poet. He has his book, Anthroposophia Theomagica, for example. And so it's a very obscure terminology, but it pointed towards what Rudolf Steiner wanted to articulate, and that is, what is a human being? And so much of his work gets into clarifying the understanding of the threefold nature of the human being, of thinking, feeling, and will, head, heart, and limbs. And that is something that is a very, very deep field of study, and it takes a great deal of dedication to be able to even scratch the surface.
Okay. All right. So there was a phrase called pleroma of spiritual beings. Now I know what plethora is. I don't know what pleroma is. I'm assuming the word is similar. Pleroma. What? Okay. So pronounce it one more time. And what does it mean?
Pleroma has to do with the whole symphony of celestial beings, so to speak. A choir. When you're looking at spiritual beings, even when you get to the first stage of the angels, Rudolf Steiner says when you come into contact with one angel, you're also in contact with the whole company of angels, so that there's this, it's like a symphonic experience, so to speak, and that because they're so united in their endeavor that they have a connectivity that is far beyond mankind, who we continually experience ourselves as being isolated and separate from each other.
And you also you mentioned, I'm going to call it a someone named, again, I'm thinking its name, Hilarion, and that sounds like, Hyperion, like it sounds like a very lofty name, like that might be a luminary or maybe perhaps the Grail Angel or something. So who or what is Hilarion?
Well, Hilarion or Ilarion, depending on, which source you're referring to, because Blavatsky at times would write it Hilarion and other times Ilarion. Mm. He is a particular, one of the great leaders of mankind. Rudolf Steiner referred to as the masters of wisdom and harmonization of sensations and feelings, and that these great beings are amongst us, but they're very unassuming, usually in their current role, so that you may meet one and not even know that you've met one, and that they're great servants of mankind. What would they would call in the East bodhisattvas, that they're here for other people, that they've already achieved states of consciousness and being that are in the future destiny of mankind. They're manifesting right now. And so they are the guru's guru, so to speak.
Is this similar to the concept of the 36 heroes in, I think it's Kabbalah, that may not even know that they're heroes, that the 36 good people who will come and help? Do you know what I'm referring to?
Well, it's akin to that. I wouldn't want to attribute sameness to it, because it's a very specific thing when you're talking about the masters of wisdom, because they're like offices, so to speak, in the hierarchy of Earth evolution. And so you have a group of 12, and only 7 of them are incarnated at any one time. And so it's very much an actual part and parcel of our relationship to this whole cosmic scheme in which we're involving, which we tend to think of as being somewhat happenstance and arbitrary. Actually, there is a divine order behind all this crazy world in which we live.
All right. If you see a stupid smile on my face, it's because there's so much depth in this, but also in a reboot of a show called Battlestar Galactica, they put so much mythology and theology in there, and they hid it in there. And I did not know this one last part until just now, and that is that. Again, this would be its own show. And in fact, I did a show where we did a deep dive into Battlestar Galactica with a science author named Matt Williams. But they basically, the Cylons created basically Cylon humans. They call them skin jobs. Well, the humans did. They look like humans, but they were Cylons. They were basically organic robots. And they were trying to create basically Nephilim, like a new breed to take us into the future. And it's all convoluted. But the point is that 7 of them were revealed until the end of the show, but it took until the end for the last 5 to be revealed. So the 7 were incarnate until the end, where we realized who the last 5 were, and that's where they got that little thing from. Or it's just a strange coincidence.
Well, you'll get that kind of thing, because, mind you, my associate Douglas Gabriel, who, when I was at the Mayflower and then I left, he took my place. And but he had been a consultant on Poltergeist, and then he was called in to consult because Werner Glass, who I told you about, who was the head of the Waldorf Institute teacher training, was head of the Waldorf School out in Hollywood. He knew all those people, right? I mean, he was like Marilyn Monroe's Anthroposophia mentor, And so it's like. He got approached by Kathleen Kennedy, and he's too busy. He directed her to talk to his protege, which is Douglas Gabriel. And so he consulted with her, and then later on, Marcia Lucas, George Lucas's wife, showed up. And so he had thematic and mythic contributions to Poltergeist and Star Wars, and also Indiana Jones series, all those. And recently I heard somebody was out at Skywalker Ranch, and they, just to check up on it because of the claims that have been made, they started looking through the library, and they noticed that preponderance of the books in the library had the stamp from the Mayflower bookshop in them. That's because they got them from the Mayflower.
Great.
You know, that's just a fact of history. What anyone might think of that. At the time, when we were doing things like that, I mean, I have somewhere in my files, I have a script from First Night. I was questioned about being a consultant for that movie. A lot of things came up over the years, you know, and so, again, we didn't think that there was that much significance to what we were doing, but we were planting seeds for the future, just like Johnny Appleseed.
Indeed. No, there's a lot of deep stuff hidden there. There's also a lot of, a lot of his surface level stuff that even I can, like basically my level, or maybe 2 years ago, Jeff, in some things. But still fun. All right. So that brings us to the Grail diagrams and the major arcana and the noble traveler. So, I think probably people can extrapolate what the noble traveler is, but it's probably best to hear it directly from the source who wrote the books anyway. So what are these 22 diagrams, the 22 arcana, and who is our noble traveler?
Okay, well, when you get into understanding the whole idea of these cosmological diagrams that I showed you earlier, that whole series of these great many, they're astronomical, astrological, relating to the mysteries of time. Rudolf Steiner said that Christ gave time back to mankind. And that is the understanding that things change over time, that we're not the same as we were even in the Middle Ages or before that. So that you have these different time periods that are stages in the soul evolution of mankind, coming after into what's called the post-Atlantean period. That there's a cycle that is designated as 25,920 years, which is interesting because you take on average 25,920 breaths in a day, and that these cycles of ages go through 2,160 years. And so you have old Indian in the age of Cancer, and then the old Persian in the age of Gemini, and then the old Egypto-Babylonian Chaldean in the age of Taurus, and then at 747 BC, you have the founding of the city of Rome at the beginning of the age of the ram, right? Age of Aries, and that's the age of the intellectual soul. And then it goes until 1413, when it begins the consciousness whole period in which we currently dwell. And so it's unfolding history with an understanding of the themes that present themselves through these developmental stages. That's what's really strongly developed in my first book. And also within those 2,160-year cycles, there are cycles of roughly 350 years of archangelic periods that go in a planetary sequence. And we're currently in the age of the Archangel Michael, which began in November of 1879. And that's the age of freedom. So we're supposed to develop an understanding of what it means to be a free and conscientious human being, capable of moral imagination, moral inspiration, moral intuition.
Wow, that's a lot.
Yeah, it is a lot. And that's why I had to write a book about it, to make it approachable.
Right. Well, two. All right.
Yeah, two.
I'm not even sure what to ask next. Is there something that I should be asking that I didn't?
Well, I think what we should be doing is thinking toward what we're going to talk about next time. I find it best not to go over long with these things because it's a lot to digest. And some people look at it and they go, oh, that's too long, I don't have time. And so I look forward to speaking with you again, and we can pursue some of these subjects in greater depth.
I do too, and I appreciate that you're offer to do that. I was going to ask you, and in fact, I'll even suggest that you suggest the order that we go through, because I think that you're the master here, we're the students, and
also, if anybody's interested, my first book is currently out of print, but I still have copies of my second book, and that's actually a good place to start. And so you can contact me through academia.org, and my handle is John Barnwell 888. You can find my channel, and instructions for getting my books are available underneath all my personal videos on there and all of that. If you need to get a hold of me, that's how you do it.
Okay, wonderful. Listen, can't thank you enough. So much information here. I can't believe it's only been an hour, because I feel like I've gotten a lot more than that in here, and I can't wait to listen back to the show. And folks, I hope you feel the same, and we're honored that Mr. Barnwell is going to join us again, and we'll figure out when that will be. And thank you all for listening. Thank you for tuning in. Please give us a rating and a review, and if possible, refer us to somebody, because referrals are more important than any sort of rating or review or suggestion by Apple or Spotify or whatever it is, a personal referral. So thank you all for coming into the Garden of Doom, and we will hear from you, or really you'll hear from us next week.
Just follow me down to the Jordan stream.